Tonight we're going to be concluding our series on the book of Habakkuk. So we've been walking through this book of lament. A lament is a moment in which we cry out to God because we're sad about all the brokenness in this world. And so it's like this biblical form of complaining. It's this worshipful form in which we go to God with the complaints and the burdens of our heart. And I just want you to know, like, it's okay and it's biblical to complain to God about the things that are burdening you. And so that's what the book of Habakkuk is about. It's a song of lament in which he goes to God with the weightiest things. And he begins processing with the Lord the tumultuous time that he's in, a time that really could have caused him to waver in his faith, but he remained unwavering in his faith. And the reason he did is because he knew the one who was faithful, he knew the one who was good, and he knew the one who would be his rock in the midst of uncertainty. And so my hope as we have kind of unpacked this book and as we conclude it tonight is that you, in those moments that are hard and the moments that are challenging and the moments that are difficult, that you would learn how to have unwavering faith, not because life isn't full of waves and difficulty and adversity, but because you have learned and are learning how to put your faith and trust in Jesus. So let me pray, and then we'll dive into the message for tonight. Jesus, thank you so much for your word. Thank you so much for these people that you have brought together specifically for tonight, God. All of us are here on purpose and for purpose. And God, I just pray that you would use your word to minister to us, to minister to me, and that through your word that you would teach all of us how we can make small changes in our lives to better experience you and better live for you in the midst of challenging moments. So it's in your holy and precious name I pray. Amen. So I know it's that time of the semester, maybe you're trying to get ready for midterms or you got exams or maybe you just got past some of them, but it can be a stressful time of the year whenever you have exams on the forefront of your mind. And for me, when I was in school, I didn't study the Bible. I studied biomedical science. And then I went to get master's in med school. And y'all, when I was in medical school, I was super stressed, like all the time, 24/7. School was really my only stressor in my life at that time. Well, it wasn't my only. I was also planning a wedding. But it was my primary stressor in life. And as a first-year med student, y'all, the way they had our exams broken down is that we took one course at a time. That course consumed your entire life. I studied for well over 80 hours a week, and that each course only had 3 exams. And so if you failed one exam, you failed the course. If you fail one course, you have to retake the whole year, not just like a class, the whole year. So you could make it all the way through the whole first year, and if you fail the last exam of the last course, and you fail that course, you now have to retake the whole year. So every exam that I walked into with the weight of the world on my shoulders and an unreal amount of stress and anxiety, because any moment could be the moment that I didn't study enough or that they ask some really hard questions and I get tripped up, and all of a sudden, it's not just a whole year of my life that I have to repeat. It's another $100K that I have to pay for, and it's come on, y'all. So, and it's all these things, and so I walked into every exam so stressed, so overwhelmed. How am I going to do this? And you guys probably had similar moments in school, maybe not to that extent, but moments where you're stressed, you're overwhelmed with whatever it is you're going through, and in those moments we often cry out. We often cry out. Maybe complain to our friends or our family, or this class is just the worst. But it's important that we cry out to the Lord in those moments. And one of the things that caused me concern as I was going into those exams is I knew that judgment was on the other side. And what I mean by that is I was going to get a grade, right? I was going to get judged based on my performance on that test and on that exam. And I was going to be scrutinized for that, and then we were going to debrief the exam and all the questions, and especially as academics, we're super type A, and so, we debate one word and why we got that question wrong, and we're broken. But I would go into that worried because I knew that judgment was coming. But that judgment not only created concern, but it also created a purpose and a preparedness in the way that I approached it. And tonight we're gonna talk about chapter 2, where Habakkuk is concerned for the people, and God's he's gonna enact judgment. But that judgment actually leads to them finding out their purpose. So let's turn to Habakkuk chapter 2. Habakkuk chapter 2, it's a really small book. It's only 3 chapters, so it can be hard to find. It's in the Old Testament. It's one of the minor prophets. But we're going to be in chapter 2 tonight. In chapter 1, Habakkuk presents his lament or his complaint to God. In chapter 2, God begins to respond to him. And so we're actually going to pick it up in verse 6. So it says this. It says, will not all of them taunt him who ridicule him and scorn them, saying, woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. So this is the Lord responding to Habakkuk. He's beginning to provide clarity to Habakkuk and the reasons for which he's allowing all this injustice and brokenness to exist in the world. And all of us who've ever seen brokenness and wickedness, we're like, God, why? Why do you allow evil in this world? And part of his response in verse 6 begins with this word, woe. Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes for himself wealthy by extortion. How long must this go on? And so this is God's response. God's response by saying, woe. And woe is a term that we don't use very often in our modern day vernacular, but it is a biblical term that is a lament of warning. It's a sign that something bad is on the horizon or could happen. And so when God says woe, it's a lament of warning. He's saying to his people, my heart is broken for y'all. My heart is broken for the people who go about life this way. And the reason my heart is broken for this type of people is because judgment is coming to people who do not turn from their sinful ways and come back to me. God longs to display love. He longs to display mercy. He longs to display his grace and his compassion. But he is a good God, and he is just. And so he will display his justice on that which is evil and on that which is wrong. And so woe is a cry of lament. It has this warning in it, and it's not just this emotional response. It's really a response of God's certainty. He's saying, this isn't something that might happen. This is something that will happen for those who don't turn from their sinful ways. And it's a woe of the injustice. So he's not lamenting the good things. He's lamenting the things that are broken in this world and the evil things in this world. And in chapter 1, Habakkuk, he asks the Lord. We talked about this the first week. He says in verse 2, he says, how long must I call for help, but you do not listen? You do not cry cry out to you violence, but you do not save. Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. Habakkuk begins this book by saying, God, where are you at? There's tons of evil. There's tons of brokenness, and you're just sitting on the sidelines doing nothing about it. And God begins to respond by saying, no, I see the injustice. I see the brokenness. I see all the wicked things that are happening, and it actually breaks my heart. And because judgment is coming to present itself against the wickedness. So there's 5 different woes that God gives in chapter 2. And so we're going to do the speed round to kind of cover these 6 woes. But we'll read them really briefly. So verse 6 says, woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey, because you have plundered many nations, and the people who are left will plunder you. For you have shed human blood. You have destroyed the lands and cities and everyone in them. The next woe is in verse 9. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain and sets his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. You have plotted the ruin of many people, shaming your own house and forfeiting your own life. The stones of this wall will cry out. The beams of the woodwork will echo it. Look at the third woe in verse 12. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. Has not the Lord the Almighty determined that the people's labor is fuel for fire, and that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. In verse 15, we get the next one. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it out from wineskins till they are drunk, so that they can gaze on their naked bodies. You'll be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup of the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The violence that you have done to Lebanon will overwhelm you in your destruction, and animals will terrify you, for you have shed human blood, and you have destroyed the lands of the cities. And then verse 18, of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman, or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it and trusts in his own creation, he makes idols that cannot speak. So the last woe in verse 19, woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or to lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? Is it covered with gold and silver? There is no breath in it. The Lord in his holy temple, let all the earth be silent before him. So this is God's response to Habakkuk. He gives him 5 woes. If we were to summarize these 5 woes, they would look like this. The first woe is that of greed. It breaks God's heart when he sees greed exists in our lives and in this world. It breaks the heart of God when he sees greed be the means by which people become wealthy. And if you ever lived this side of heaven, you've probably experienced that in some way, shape, or form. I used to have a landlord that just kept ratcheting it up over and over again, and it wasn't because of inflation. It was just because he could, and he had the power and the authority to do that. And so he kept inflating the price. I had somebody empty my bank account, and they stole all of our money. Identity theft. Greed is a real thing that we experience in this world. People want to get wealthy quick by any means necessary. And it doesn't come out of a desire to allow others to flourish. It comes out of a desire for their own great gain. And it comes at the expense of others. So we see God say, woe. Woe to those who get wealthy by unjust gain. For the means by which they do so will happen to them. It may look good for a moment. They may look like they've made it, and they got lots of money, and they got lots of wealth, and they have everything that this earth could offer. But a time is coming in which they will experience the reversal, because they've obtained that which they have through greed and not through a God-honoring means. Then he goes on to say in verse 9 through 11, he says, woe. Woe to those who use their power in corrupt ways. All of us know somebody, whether it was a teacher or a coach or perhaps a parent or a legislative leader who used their power to hurt and to harm those in their care. They used it for their own advancement and their own benefit, and they did it at the expense of others. God says there will be a reversal. There will be a time in which those who use their power for their own good will be judged, because God's a good God. He's a just God. The third one, woe to those of who are unjust. Woe to those who don't follow the law of God and go their own way. Again, taking advantage of people. And then the fourth one says, woe to those who are immoral. The way that he actually describes it, if you look at verse 15 through 17, he says, woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskins until they get drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. What is this describing? This is describing a person in a position of power being generous, saying, hey, why don't you take another drink? Don't worry, I got this one. I'll cover you. Why? Not because this person's truly being generous and God honoring, but because they have a perverted motive underneath it. They just want to see the person get drunk so that they can objectify that person and gaze upon their own nakedness. And so God says, woe to the person who takes advantage of other people, who manipulates them, who abuses them, who objectifies them. You don't even need to use wine to do this in our current day. All you need is a computer and you can take advantage of people. And so God says, woe to those who are immoral, who objectify other people, who are made in the image of God. He says, you'll be filled with shame instead of glory. We were made for the glory of God. We were made to bear the image of God. We were made to glorify him. And he says, when we objectify other people, then we will be filled with shame instead of glory. Anyone who's participated in any of these things, whether it's greed or corruption or injustice or immorality, you've experienced the guilt of shame that comes with walking in a way that's not honoring to the Lord. And so he says, woe to those who walk in immorality. And then the last one is woe to those who make idols. Woe to those who try to carve something out of wood and then say, speak, give me wisdom, or do that out of stone. And for those in the 21st century, maybe none of y'all are craftsmen or welders or, y'all don't work in a trade. You're like, I don't do that. But we all do. We all make idols of things that are lifeless. We make idols out of this. We make idols out of our GPA. We make idols out of our relationships. We make idols out of anything that isn't God because we put our worth and our value in it, and we seek direction from it instead of from God. And so instead of following Jesus, we follow whatever social media has to tell me, or whatever ChatGPT has to tell me, or whatever my friend has to tell me, or whatever my desires lead me. And then we end up wondering why we're not experiencing joy and hope and peace. And it's because we've walked away from God in his ways. So God gives these 5 woes, and these are woes of lament. But they're not just lament. They're not just God lamenting. Yes, he's brokenhearted for any of us and all of us who are in one of these positions. But it's also a sign of warning. When Isaiah gets near the stovetop, I say, yo, Zay. I start yelling at him. I'm like, Zay, back up. Dude, get your hands. You know what I mean? And I don't yell at him for the sake of scaring him or condemning him. I yell at him for the sake of trying to get his attention and indicate that there's a warning. Hey, if you touch the stove, it's going to be really, really hot and it's going to be painful. And so when God gives a woe to you and I, he's not doing it because he's trying to be mean or because he has malicious intent. He's doing it as a good father saying, hey, I don't want you to get burned. I don't want you to experience the penalty and the punishment of sin. I'd rather you experience the freedom that I've come to offer you through the person of Jesus. But if you're not careful, if you do not turn from what you're doing and pull back and change your ways, then you're going to experience the pain and the affliction that comes from disobeying what I've asked you to do. And so he gives it as a warning to us because he's so kind to us. And so that's chapter 2. That's God's warning and his response. He says, I get it. There's brokenness in this world. I long to correct it. And so then in chapter 3, we see how Habakkuk responds to this warning. So it says this in chapter 3. We pick it up in verse 2. It says, he says, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. And so Habakkuk takes time to remember the character of God. To remember that not only is God good and God is just, but God is merciful. Mercy simply means withholding that which we deserve. God often doesn't give us what we do deserve. And the reason he doesn't give us what we deserve is because he's merciful. And so Habakkuk responds to these 5 woes of judgment, not by complaining, not by saying you're an evil God, but by remembering who God is and saying, man, you're so merciful. And when we're in moments that are hard, when we're in moments that are difficult, when we experience the brokenness of this world, we need to be reminded that God is merciful. Y'all, when I was on 6th Street with Steve and Seb, and we're walking down, and y'all, I shared the gospel with more strippers than I ever have in my life. Like, and we're walking down this, and not because I was in the club, y'all, because I was on the street. Let me clarify. When I'm walking down, like, my heart is broken for people who are lost, and for people who are seeking fulfillment in all these wrong places. And as I'm walking down the street, the Lord is constantly reminding me that, man, just as much as they need Jesus, I need Jesus. And the only way I'm going to be a messenger of the gospel and a messenger for him is if I recognize that I also am in much as need of the gospel as they are. And so I need to constantly be remembering the mercy that was shown first and foremost to me. And I need to reflect on that in the midst of a broken world, in the midst of talking to people who are confused about their identity, in the midst of talking to people who don't know what their purpose is, in the midst of talking to people of every race, nationality, background. Y'all, I talked to a dude who was studying a demonic text. There's so many different people I talked to, and he thought like the hope was in this text, the Kabbalah, and like, again, like throughout all these conversations, the Lord is reminding me that I'm in need of the mercy of God just as much as they are. And that's the reason that we went, and that's the reason that we share. But too often we look at the brokenness and the sin in this world and we just go, God, where are you at? Why do you allow this to happen? Why do you allow this to exist? Why do you allow this person to be in power? Why do you allow this world event to happen? And he's like, have you not forgotten who I am? Have you forgotten that I'm good? Have you forgotten that I'm just? Have you forgotten that I'm merciful? And so Habakkuk, in the midst of the brokenness, remembers the mercy of God. Not only does he remember the mercy of God, he then responds. We see 3 things that Habakkuk does. Number 1, he remembers. Number 2, he responds. And then number 3, he rejoices. So let's look at his response. If you keep going beyond verse 2, in verse 3 through 6, he says this: God came from Teman, the Holy One, from the Mount of Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hands. Where his power was hidden, plague was before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled, and the age-old hills collapsed. But he marches on forever. This is Habakkuk remembering the goodness of God. And for those of y'all sitting here reading this and you're like, I have no idea what the heck this dude is saying, what's he talking about? He's talking about the Exodus. He's talking about a moment in Israel's history where the Israelites were under oppression from the Egyptians, and God, by his divine power and by his own might, delivered them out of oppression and out of bondage. And he freed them from the bondage of Pharaoh, and he completely obliterated the Egyptian army all by himself, not because the Israelites had an army. He just wiped them out with the Red Sea, and he allowed the Red Sea to become a highway for his people to experience deliverance. And so Habakkuk is taking time to remember not only that God is merciful, but that he's good, and that he's powerful, and that he's a savior. And he's reflecting on the character of God. He's remembering the character of God. And sometimes I think the reason our faith begins to waver is because we get into moments that are hard and difficult, or we see the brokenness of this world, and then we have like spiritual amnesia. We forget that he's good. We forget that he's faithful. We forget that he's saved us. We forget that he's all powerful. And so our faith begins to waver and teeter and totter and all these things because we're like, I don't know if you're who you say you are. And so we need to actively remember who he is. We need to call it to mind. We need to have practices and disciplines in our life where we're choosing to remember these things about the characteristics of God. And then he goes on to finally respond. As he's remembering the character of God, he then responds. So we'll kind of fast forward to verse 18. He says this. He says, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. For the director of music on the stringed instruments." So again, it ends with that sentence because this is a song. This is the whole book. All 3 chapters. They're not just a letter. This is a song that that Israel would sing, so that they could actively remember the goodness of God in the midst of hardship. The way that I got through med school and through stressful moments where I was like overwhelmed, I was like, I don't know how I'm going to make it through this, was by remembering who God was and rejoicing in the midst of the storm. That's how I made it through med school. And sometimes we lose sight of God because we're not willing to remember and we're not willing to rejoice. Habakkuk doesn't ask God to change his circumstance, but rather God changes his view of God in the midst of the circumstance. And that's why verse 18 says that he's like that. He has feet of a deer, that he can climb any mountain, that he can overcome any adversity, because God's created him to do it. This is just a side note. I don't know if y'all have ever seen an ibex, but if you haven't, when you get home, go on to Google or go on your phone and type in ibex climbs mountains. It's amazing. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen it. Did I include any video of it in this thing? I don't know if I was able to find one in the slide deck. I don't know if here's a picture, but it's not nearly as cool. Y'all go watch the video. These dudes, they climb dams. They climb vertical walls where you're like, there's no ledge for them to climb. And they have these massive bellies, and you're like, how are they defying gravity right now? I wouldn't be able to do that. I'd be like rolling all the way down. You're just like, there goes Pastor, bye-bye. And he was with the Lord. But like, you look at these creatures, and they were made for adversity. They were made to be able to overcome hard challenges and difficult climbs because God equipped their feet for adversity. And the way in which God equips us for adversity is by giving us the means to remember and to rejoice in who he is. He doesn't change the circumstance. He doesn't change the terrain. He leaves it as rugged as it is. But it's the ruggedness that allows us to depend on the Lord. And I think if life weren't difficult, if life weren't challenging, it'd be easy. We wouldn't have to depend on God. But because it's challenging, because it's hard, we get to depend on the Lord. And in the midst of that, we get to respond by rejoicing. So I think the most fitting way to conclude a series is to end in worship and to end in praise, because God is so good and he is worthy of our praise. So we're gonna close tonight by rejoicing. But before we do, let me just pray, and then we will sing this last song. Father God, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for, God, your character. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your compassion. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your kindness. God, I'm so glad that you are strong enough and powerful enough to deal with all that life throws at us. We choose to believe that. We choose to remember that in the midst of moments that are hard. And we choose to rejoice in you. And so it's in your holy and precious name I pray, amen.